Hey everyone, welcome. If you're live today and also if you're catching the replay, welcome as well. Looks like there's already a bunch of people here. You guys are pretty active in the chat, and some of you already sharing where you're coming from too. So I see Brian, Celtic Tiger, Uni, Rob, Florin, let's see, and Carrie Ann have all been chatting here in the group. So if you haven't already shared, let me know where you're tuning in from today. It's always nice to see where everybody is from. I know Rob already mentioned he's in Houston. I'm not sure if anybody else has mentioned it yet. And Carrie Ann is in Ottawa. Cool. Oh, and a bunch of you are already mentioning Scribal School, which is coming up in a few weeks. You'll be hearing more about that soon for sure. So stay tuned on that one. I'm actually going to share with you a little bit of the materials I have prepared for that today, just a little bit of what's going into Module 1. And I'm in the process of creating those materials and make sure everything's ready for you guys. The Celtic Tigers in Ireland, and Tanakh is do you pronounce it David or Davida? From Italy. And Florin's in Romania. Florin goes by Mega something there, but he's told me his name before, so that's why I'm calling him that. P says he's only got one more week of work from home. Aw. Well, I hope you'll be able to catch us live sometimes, P, at least, maybe. I don't know what time zone you're in, whether maybe you could align it with a lunch or something like that, but you're in Alabama, so you're probably in Eastern time zone, unless you're in a tiny little corner that I think is in Central. Or is most of Alabama in Central? Now I can't remember where the line is exactly. It's somewhere there. So I used to be in the Eastern time zone, and now I'm in Central, but I'm pretty far from the line. So you're also in Central. Yeah, so it's 2 for you. A little late for lunch, but maybe close enough you can get it to work. So, all right. So what I was going to share with you a bit today, guys, and I think most of you are on my email list, and so you probably already saw my email, which I started out with talking about how to actually type out hieroglyphs the way that you see me do for my videos, and I use for teaching all of the time. And this is sort of an outgrowth of that, of how else do we write Egyptian other than just in the hieroglyphs? I mean, in modern times, that is, not necessarily how they're writing them in ancient times. So first of all, I do want to make sure, in case you are not on my email list, that you do have the link for the program I was talking about in that email, which is called JSesh. It's a totally free open source software that's basically kind of like a basic word processor, but for hieroglyphs. And I will pop the link for that in the chat if I can get my copy and paste to work properly. Sometimes I think I've used the shortcut for copying, and then somehow when I go to paste it in the chat box, I get something I copied earlier. So that's the link for where you can pick up JSesh if you don't already have it. So, Celtic Tiger, you're asking about a link for Scribal School. So the doors are not open yet for that, but I do have a VIP waitlist you can sign up for, which you can find at scribalschool.com. I'll type it in the chat box, but it's also pretty easy to remember. I have to tell you, I was over the moon when I discovered nobody had taken that domain, because I just feel like it's the perfect name for it, and it's easy to remember. So that's the link for that in case you need it. Yeah, and it looks like some of you have JSesh already. Cool. So yeah, Brian, I'm sure you probably had JSesh for a while. And so JSesh, I have to admit, I was a little bit of a late adopter with that. I was kind of, through most of grad school, actually afraid to mess with the hieroglyphic editors because they seemed really difficult to use. I'm not sure why I felt that way, because I'm actually pretty tech inclined, so I'm not sure why I was intimidated by it, but I was. So I held off for quite a long time before I actually used one. And so by the time I got into it, JSesh was really the thing by then. There have been many others before it as well. And when I first started using it, I have to admit it was slow going at first. It takes some time to get used to what shortcuts you can use in typing to get the hieroglyphs you want, and also how to get them to group. But as I talked about in the email, I recommend using, there's a hieroglyphic palette. If you have the main program open, and you go to the Windows menu, you can pick hieroglyphic palette, and that gives you like the whole list of signs categorized out in what we call the Gardner sign list order. So the order that the Egyptologist Alan Gardner put them in. And you can also search by sounds. If you happen to know the sounds of the hieroglyph, you can type those in a search box. So that's a really easy way to get started with finding hieroglyphs, and then you might start to notice how they show up in the little box or how they're typed. And then you can also use menus for grouping hieroglyphs, say vertically or horizontally or however you want. And again, that's what I did initially, and it took a lot of time. But then I started to notice, oh, they use a colon for this, or they use a star for this when typing. And so now I can just type those things, and it's a lot faster. But it's good to just get started with using the basics, and it'll be slow at first, but then you kind of get the hang of it. So apologies, I just realized I left the door open to the room, so I'm going to just jump up for a moment and close it to try and reduce any annoying noise that there might be in the background. So I will be right back. Okay, back. Now I can't guarantee the cat won't show up and start making noise, of course, but that should at least reduce other noises. She's already meowing from down the hall, actually. I can hear it. So I don't know if she's motivated enough to actually come down this way, though. We'll see. So anyway, I do highly recommend JSesh, but what I wanted to get into now really was sort of taking that a step further and talking about how else do we write the sounds for Egyptian hieroglyphs. So I'm going to switch over to some slides I prepared for you guys so that you can see the actual examples of how this works. So first of all, some of you, I imagine that you guys have all watched at least probably a little bit of my videos before, although there might be a couple newcomers. So if you've seen my videos, you'll know that we have this sort of way of representing sounds in Egyptian that might look pretty funny to you if you're not used to it. We call it transliteration. And this is basically a way of transforming what we understand of the sounds in Egyptian into an alphabetic script so that it's easier to render those signs when we're communicating with each other or publishing professional articles, books, and so forth. We'll oftentimes also use typeset hieroglyphs like we use in JSesh, but oftentimes we also need the transliteration so that we can communicate to other people how we're interpreting the hieroglyphs, what sounds we're interpreting for them, and so forth. So we use a system called transliteration for this. And most of the signs in transliteration are actually pretty straight up like our alphabet in English and other Western languages. So if you have like the lower leg hieroglyph that's a B sound, for example, you're going to transliterate that as a B. It's a simple one-to-one. But because there are also sounds in Egyptian that we don't have in Western languages for the most part, we also have a system of other signs for representing those sounds that we don't have in our standard, Western Roman character kind of alphabet. So for example, for the Aleph, which we understand was for most of ancient Egyptian history a glottal stop kind of sound, and I'm not going to get into all the sounds. I've done that in my videos. Y'all can check those out. But just to give you an example of how these are transliterated. So for the Aleph, we have the two little curves that look kind of like a 3, although they're not actually typed the same way. The reed leaf is actually pretty straightforward. Again, 2 as we type it like an I, although we call it a yod. Double reed leaf is a Y. Quail chick, or the curly Q that goes with it, that's a substitute for it, is W. So we do, as you might have noticed when I do my videos, we have different pronunciations sometimes for these signs that don't necessarily match up with the transliteration. So a quail chick, for example, sometimes we pronounce like a W, sometimes we pronounce it as if it's a long U, like an oo sound. That's just a modern convention. It doesn't necessarily reflect Egyptian pronunciation, but we always transliterate it as a W because then we know what it is exactly in Egyptian that we're trying to render into a Western alphabet. So Ayin is another one of the more unusual signs. It doesn't look like our usual alphabet. It is a sound like Aleph that also occurs in Semitic languages such as Arabic and Hebrew. And we have our little curve for that. So a few others that are, I'm not listing all of them here. I don't think, yeah, no, I didn't put all of them here. So I tried to put the ones that were a little more unusual because you don't necessarily need to know, things like B, P, F, etc. are just B, P, F, M, N. Those are all the same in transliteration. So these are just the specialty kinds of ones. So we do have 4 H's in Egyptian. So the first one, which is our little sort of house plan one, which I didn't put on here, we just translated as a regular old H. And then we have what we call dotted H, what we call third H, and what we call fourth H. So again, I've done videos on almost all of these. I think fourth H I haven't done yet, which I will do. It's a little bit less common than the other H's, or the less common than dotted H and third H at least. So we have these different signs that we put underneath them or above, or different ways of doing it to be able to distinguish these different sounds so that we know what we're talking about, again, how it equates to the Egyptian. The doorbell, I'll just briefly mention, the reason why it can be S or Z is that originally in Old Egyptian it was a different sound. And I don't believe it was actually a Z, but it's rendered in modern times as a Z. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I can't remember in Old Egyptian. I want to say it's a J or something like that in Old Egyptian. But in any case, it's transliterated as a Z in Old Egyptian, but by the time you get to Middle Egyptian, which is roughly around the time of what we call the Middle Kingdom, this sound has morphed into a regular old S, and it's indistinguishable from the other S. So usually for Middle Egyptian and later, we transliterate it as an S, because it can be used interchangeably with the other S. And then we have what we call Shin, again, deriving these names a lot of times from Arabic and Hebrew. And we have a little sign on top of the S to let you know that this is a sh sound rather than an S. Just a couple more. Some people, for the little hill sign, some people use a dotted K, some people use a Q. They are the same sound. It's a little annoying that we have some inconsistencies in it, but they're the same thing. So people either call it Q or dotted K, depending on which one they're using. And then for the T and the D that have underlines, we call those second T and second D. The regular old D and T we just call D and T, and they have a straight up transliteration. So one issue though with transliteration is you need a special font to be able to write this. And so you guys are really quiet right now, but I'm guessing you're probably all like, how do I type these, right? So if you want to type these, for example, you need to get what's called a transliteration font. And there are a number of them out there. If you Google transliteration font or Egyptian transliteration font, you'll find a bunch. Some of them do have limitations of like only for non-commercial use or only for certain types of publications and things like that. One that a lot of people use is the same one that the Darul Medina project uses in their database, and also the online Egyptological bibliography also uses it, so it's a pretty standard one. Good one to have on your computer if you're going to use those websites too, so that you can actually see the transliteration properly. And that can be found at the Darul Medina project's website, which I will pop into the chat, so you can download that one if you want. I have that one myself. I also have one that I downloaded so long ago that I honestly don't actually know where I got it from because, well, I'm not going to say how long ago it was. It was at the beginning of grad school. It was a long time ago. So I couldn't tell you where I got that one, and the source is probably not even around anymore. So I use that one a lot, but I also use this one sometimes. They're very similar. So, but then even if you have a transliteration font, you can't always use one. So for example, even though I have this font, I can't go and type in the YouTube chat with it. It won't show up. You can't use it on, Instagram or Facebook or anything like that. Yes, it is a Dutch site. And you're welcome, Carlos. So because of that, in the 80s, I believe it was, a team came up with a system for how to type on the computer in hieroglyphs. Because for a really long time, even publications were handwritten in Egyptian. So one of the most common dictionaries, for example, and I'll pull it out to show you guys. I'm not sure if I'll have to switch to my camera, and I'm not sure if this will come out real clear, but we'll see. One of the more popular beginner dictionaries, and it is actually, I believe there are scans of it online if you want to check it out or order a copy, is A Concise Dictionary of Middle Egyptian by Faulkner. And this one, even though, I mean, it is on the old side, but it's not like super old. I can't remember what year it was originally printed. What's it say? It's just giving me the reprint dates in here. Where's the original? Yeah, 1962. So it's not like it's from the 19th century or something. It's not that old. But you'll see it's actually all handwritten. The hieroglyphs, the actual notes in English and so forth are all in handwritten stuff. So I'm really used to this because this is what I used my first few years in grad school. So it doesn't bother me at all that it's handwritten, but when you're new to it, it can definitely be hard. Some of my students have been like, I can't stand his handwriting and so forth. So I know it can be annoying. But this is one of the problems we had in Egyptology. Was like, it was really hard to typeset before computers. It was really hard to typeset hieroglyphs and transliteration and so forth. So a lot of things were still handwritten until relatively recently. Not everything, but some things like this. And I believe somebody has actually transcribed this using JSASH and a word processor into a more modern typeset version. So if you Google looking for this book, you'll probably find it. I don't really fully understand what the legal ramifications are of the fact that somebody basically just typeset the whole book, but I've seen it out there, so I don't know. I'll leave that to your discretion. In any case, one of the problems with this is, once we were able to have fonts for transliteration and other things, there are still some cases where you couldn't use certain fonts. So like I said, I can't type them in the chat here and so forth. And so one of the things that this team came up with, and they came up with a manual, and it's in French, so it's, I believe, called my French pronunciation is horrible, so please forgive me. It's the Manual de Codage, I believe is how you would pronounce it. Those of you who know French better than I do will probably be horrified. And they came up with a system for transliteration and then also for this, like a standard character version of that you didn't need a special font for. So a lot of times if we're talking about Egyptian, like in a Facebook group, for example, or something like that, and we have to type stuff in, this is the system that we use for typing that because we can't use transliteration. So let me go back to my screen so I can show you guys. Yes, Carrie Ann has typed it into the chat box, the name of it. I think I actually typoed it in the slides. Apologies for that. I will fix it. I haven't had these proofread yet because they're pretty new. So I messed up the day on here. So like I said here, when we can't use a transliteration font on the computer, so for example on social media, we follow this system. So the cool thing about this is that once you're, let me get rid of my image because it's going to overlap here. Is that once you are used to this is actually also the same way you're going to end up typing when you type in things like JSASH, for example. So if you want an aleph, you're going to type a capital A. That's how you get it without having to like search through the birds and get the right one and so forth. You're going to type a capital A. Same thing if you're using a transliteration font. If you want the aleph in transliteration, you're going to type a capital A. So, and then, So on and so forth. So ein, that we use a lowercase a for that. Dotted H, regular old H is just H. So again, just like with transliteration, the ones that are standard, like a B or something, is you're just going to type B. But if you're going to do something that has special diacritic marks, like dots or dashes or whatever, like the dotted H, that's going to be a capital H. For third H, it's an X. Fourth H is a capital X. So there's not a ton of these, really. There's only about 10 that are really specialized. So for the door bolt, again, you can use Z, although some people use S because of how the sound changes. But if you want to get the door bolt specifically in JSesh, for example, rather than the folded cloth, you're going to type a Z rather than an S, because they're distinguished in that way. So, and then for shin, we do a capital S as opposed to the lowercase s. For dotted K or Q, we use a Q. Second T is a capital T. Second D is a capital D. So same basic idea, basically, that a lot of times if you have two of the same kind of sound, so the difference between D and second D, for example, we'll use a lowercase for the one that sounds more like the D in our Western languages, and then we'll use the capital for the one that's a little bit different, and so forth. So Carlos was asking about an English to Middle Egyptian dictionary reverse hieroglyphic vocabulary. I actually haven't used that one. Is that one of the ones that's by Bill Petty, I think it is? I can't remember. I haven't actually used any of his before, so I can't say. I think some of my students have used them, but haven't really thoroughly looked at them myself. I use Faulkner's, my most basic one, and then most how do I put it? Like more thorough, I guess you could say, kind of hardcore dictionaries for Egyptian are in German. So I have a bunch of, I have some dictionaries that are German to Egyptian. So I'll switch around my camera here. So like this one, for example, which is a not huge comprehensive one, but it's more comprehensive than Faulkner, for example. However, I don't expect you, unless you are actually German or fluent in German, I wouldn't expect you to get a dictionary like this. Faulkner's a good starting one. I haven't checked out the more recent sort of intro ones, so I'm not 100% sure about how good those are. Let's see. Dave, oh hi Dave, good to see you. Asking about the T with the curved top on the pestle. I'm not sure which one you mean, Dave. I think I know the one you mean. It looks kind of like a teardrop, but has like a curved top to it. I'm guessing that's the one that you mean. So let me know in the chat when there's a little bit of a delay, so I can't see your response immediately, but let me know in the chat if that is the one that you mean. So U33, yes, that's the one. Yeah, so that's actually written as T yod or TI, more simply. So because it's two sounds actually rather than one. So it's not just a T, it's the T yod. That's funny. YouTube makes me approve any of your comments that have hieroglyphs in them. I guess maybe because they can't figure out if they're appropriate or not. So they just held Dave's comment for a minute until I approved it. All right, and George was asking about typing hieroglyphs on an Android phone. So I don't know of any. I know there are apps. I don't know of any specific ones. I personally have an iPhone, and I honestly don't use the hieroglyphic apps on my phone much. I do have one of the ones that gives you a hieroglyphic keyboard, which I use on occasion, but I find it makes these such teeny tiny hieroglyphs and stuff that I find that they're not very useful for a lot of things. Every now and then I'll use them just to type something like in a Facebook comment or something like that, but I don't. So I would just like look through I forget what do they call the App Store on Android, the Play Store or something like that. I would look through and see what there is and see what people are saying in the reviews. I imagine if you just search for like Egyptian hieroglyphs, there's probably a ton of them. is my guess. I think there are a number for the iPhone as well, and that's more regulated than on Android. So on Android, there's probably a gazillion of them. I'm not sure any of them are wonderful in terms of ease of use, but there are a bunch out there, because I find at least the one I have is very limited in the hieroglyphic. Sorry, I just lost my train of my thought. This always happens. I need to not look at the chat all the time, because when I look at the chat, then I'm like, wait, what was I talking about? Now I'm totally forgot. What was I talking about with apps? Oh yeah. So when I've tried to type things with the hieroglyphs on my phone, I find a lot of times the problem is first of all, I have to scroll through all these signs to find the one I want. I can't just like type something. And then a lot of times they won't have actually the sign that I want, because it's only like some of the most common signs. They leave a lot of them out. So it's like kind of limited use. So I don't know. There might be other ones that are better. To be honest, I haven't spent the time to like go through a bunch of them. Oh, hi, Mike. Michael Ibrahim just joins us too. Oh, and you're welcome, Dave. Glad that was helpful. So George said probably isn't the most helpful answer, but I hope that you can find one that you like. I was mainly talking about using JSesh to type on your computer, and it's totally free, and it works on both Mac and on Windows as well. So, and I put that in the chat earlier. I think you can scroll back in the chat if you've come in new, so you can get the links. I put in a link for JSesh, and I also put in a link for a transliteration font. So let me know if you all have any other questions also about any of that. You can go ahead and pop your questions in the chat. And for anybody who's just joined us, I guess a little recap is I talked about how you can use JSesh for typing out hieroglyphs and grouping them the way that you want. And you can always go back and watch the replay to catch the earlier part of that. And then how we use transliteration as a way of communicating how we're interpreting the hieroglyphs and what sounds written in an alphabet. And then when we don't have transliteration, we use a more standardized, not more standardized, I should say, but a different way of standardizing, where we can use regular old characters and use things like capital letters in place of the ones that would have diacritics. So, for example, these. That's something that was developed in the 1980s. So whenever we're typing on YouTube or in social media and stuff, for example, this is why you'll see people, and I do it actually in my titles of my YouTube videos. You've probably been wondering, like, why is this M capital A lowercase a? Like, what does that mean? That's because I'm typing with this manual décodage version by using the capital letters in place of the ones that we don't have standard symbols for. I should say, in English at least, where we would need the specialized transliteration fonts. All right, so just taking a look at the chat. Celtic Tiger's asking about clues to know when a word ends and when it begins. I've actually gotten multiple emails about that recently. There's probably something I ought to do a video on at some point. And so Celtic Tiger asking about when so it's kind of a tricky thing about learning when words start and end. And actually, I'm glad I happen to have this handy because I want to show you guys this. So when I was in grad school learning Egyptian, after we went through a whole grammar book, this is usually how it's done at university. You spend a semester or more basically learning from a standard grammar book, and then you start reading literature or other texts afterwards. So this is the first large text that I read in grad school, which is The Shipwrecked Sailor. And so when I was fairly new to this still as well, I definitely had trouble telling where one word ended and another began. And so as I worked through the text, you can see that I was using my pencil to circle the word so that you could see like where one starts and where it ends, where does the next one start, and so forth. Because there is no spacing or punctuation in Egyptian. It's all just sort of run together. So these days I don't do that because I mean, there are times I don't immediately recognize necessarily a word or like where it ends or something like that. But most of the time, because I'm used to the patterns, it just kind of jumps out at me. So for learning that, I think some of it comes with knowing some of the signs. So for example, most words end with a determinative. So once you're familiar with the determinatives, even if you don't know exactly what they are or something, but you recognize it and you say, okay, that's not a sound, that's not a phonetic sign, that's not one that has sounds, that's got to be a determinative. That's usually going to give you a clue that that's around the end of the word. So that's one way. There are some words that don't have determinatives in them, especially shorter words like prepositions and things like that. But a lot of the vocabulary will have determinatives. So that's one way that can really help. But some of it is just practice, to be honest. It takes a fair amount of time of just sort of grappling with text, I guess you could say, translating them, figuring them out. And I mean, I'll tell you, when I was in grad school, reading a text like this, I mean, I just spent hours and hours trying to figure out what words were and like looking them up in a dictionary because most of this vocabulary I didn't know already. And so sometimes there was a lot of looking up different stuff in the dictionary before I finally went, oh, this is that word. Okay, now that makes sense. So, you know, as you practice more, you get to know more of the vocabulary and you get to sort of recognize some of the patterns. And then that helps you speed up in the future. But I would say still, like the vast majority of Egyptologists, even though we're trained in the language, unless we have like an eidetic memory, that is like a photographic memory kind of thing, generally speaking, we're still going to be using dictionaries and checking comparative texts and things like that. Like, unless it's a fairly standard or formulaic text, most of the time we do have to spend some time really figuring it out. If it's a very formulaic text, a lot of times, or it has vocabulary we're very familiar with already, then oftentimes we can pick it up and be like, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. But definitely the more you do it, the better at it you get with that. So James is asking about if there are any fiction movies that get the hieroglyphs correct. Well, most of the time they don't. But you do have some cases like in Stargate. So, okay, I have not seen Stargate in like super long time, so I can't remember what they actually use in the visuals and whether hieroglyphs on things are correct in the movie. That I don't recall. But I do know that the dialogue created for that movie was actually created by an Egyptologist named Stuart Tyson Smith. And so it really does actually have an authentic Egyptian language underpinning. Now, of course, we don't fully understand how Egyptian was pronounced, so he had to kind of make up the pronunciation based on what we do know and our standardizations and things like that. But in terms of the vocabulary and the consonant sounds, at least in them and stuff, it's pretty accurate. The vowels are like, we're still kind of like, we don't really know that well. But Carlos is asking about the cost of Scribal School. When I make the official announcement, I will let you know about that. So Dennis, about text to read like the one I just showed. So the one I just showed comes from a publication, which actually I'm not sure you can really get a hold of much anymore. It might only be on the used market. I just happened into a used copy at one point that's in really good condition. And that one actually was photocopied by my professor. That's how I ended up with the copy of it. But this one I did manage to get a used copy of at some point, which is called the Egyptian Reading Handbook by Adrian Debuck. So if you can find it, it has a bunch of texts like that. They're in his handwriting, which, again, kind of like Faulkner, it takes some getting used to. So it can be really annoying at first, getting used to his handwriting. I know, because I've assigned some of these to my students sometimes, and they're like, I can't tell what his birds are. So it can be a little annoying at first. They're like, is that an aleph? Is that an M? And so forth. But once you get used to his handwriting, then, you know, it's the same thing with Egyptian scribes, too, because they all write things a little bit differently. So sometimes with the handwriting, you're like, wait, which bird is that? Trying to think what else. There's also more recently a book by Jim Allen, or I mean, officially it goes by James Allen, so that's what you'll find it under. I think I have it handy around here somewhere, but I can't remember where I put it. Oh, it's actually up here on the shelf, but I can't reach with my headphones in. All right, and of course I dropped a buck in the process. So this one is handy too. It's called Middle Egyptian Literature, 8 literary works of the Middle Kingdom. And the nice thing about it is it gives you these texts in a typeset hieroglyphs over here. Then there's transliteration, and then translation. So it's a handy one for that. There is also, as somebody was just mentioning, there's also a lot online. So there are a few people, I don't know if they were students or what their situation was, who have published online their transliterations and translations that they've done. So you can find that kind of stuff online too. But this definitely has some good practice if you want, at least if you want literature. It doesn't have the James Allen one doesn't have any like historical documents, letters, that kind of stuff. It's all literature, which is what I started with in Egyptian. Although honestly, it's not my favorite way to start things with my students. I prefer to use the kinds of things that you're actually going to see in museums or on a tour in Egypt or even scrolling through Instagram. Literature is fun in its own way, but it's not the kind of stuff that you'll walk into a museum and be like, oh, that's a shipwrecked sailor stuff. So I don't usually start with those kinds of texts myself when I'm teaching. So let's see. I'm trying to go back in the chat here because now there's a bunch of other stuff. Let's see. Answer the question about text. I suppose as well as of contextual understanding. P says yes, that's true. Oftentimes things are contextual, especially for there are some words that are spelled the same way, and the way that you can tell which one it is basically by the larger context. Apologies. I hope that's not too loud. I don't know where that sound's coming from, but it sounds like somebody's like playing drums outside or something. So let's see. Yep, Celtic Tiger says starting to pick up the determinatives. Brian was chiming in with true. I'm not sure which one that was, whether that would maybe Debuck's handwriting. Yes, the Mummy movie did kind of defame the scarab beetles. Huh? All right. Carlos, how long does it take to learn in my level? That's a good question. I think it depends on the person. I have to say that it did not come easily to me. So I would say it took me probably 2 to 3 years in grad school before I really felt like I had a pretty good handle on the language and the structure of it, and so forth. And graduate school is also very, very heavy on the grammatical structure and syntax, and that was a lot harder for me to grasp. So those were things that took me longer for sure. But I've known other scholars who were like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. And so it takes them a little while to learn it, but it didn't struggle quite as much as like I did in the beginning. And so maybe it's a bit faster. It's hard to tell though, because sometimes other people had more background before grad school and stuff like that. And it depends on how much time you put into it, how much you practice, everybody I think has kind of a little bit of a different style of doing it too. So there's a lot of factors there. And then I would say over the years, I've had some years where I didn't use it very much. And so I maybe got a bit rusty, but then I got into using the language again a lot more, either for research or for teaching. And it came back to me a lot faster. It's not like relearning it or anything like that once I've known it before, but I had to sort of refresh my memory on some stuff. So, I've been doing it kind of, I guess you could call it kind of on and off for not quite 2 decades, but most of 2 decades. But I haven't been like, studying it every day for that whole time or anything. So don't get too intimidated by that. I've definitely had long periods where I was just concentrating on other kinds of research and I wasn't using it much. So P was pointing out that I have a doctorate in publication. Yes, I do. So, and so Dennis is asking about what would be the most common texts. I would say, so like some of the stuff that I like to start with are the kinds of texts like what we call the offering formula, which shows up on stele a lot. It also shows up in tombs. So it's a very much a funerary realm kind of material. But that's the kind of stuff you're going to see in museums. And it's the kind of stuff you'll see a lot of in Egypt as well when you visit various tombs and things like that. So I think the offering formula is a good sort of early thing to learn, as well as related things such as names, titles, how they write the dates and kings' names, what else? Family terminology, and then a couple of the forms of the verb, which I think are the most important too. So one that's the infinitive is used in captions, for example, on scenes and stuff. So when you're looking at tomb scenes, they'll describe what's going on in the scene, or sometimes on stele and other and in temples as well. And then the past form that we call the sejam nf, which also occurs a lot in the same kinds of contexts where people are talking about their lives. We refer to those as autobiographies or biographies. They're not like modern biographies. They're pretty different style, but they do talk about themselves in the past, usually with that kind of form of verb. So those are the things I personally teach first, because I think they are the most useful in terms of the things that you're going to see a lot. Jihad's asking about the book I held up. I'm guessing I held up a couple different ones, but I'm guessing maybe you mean the Allen one, Middle Egyptian Literature. Yeah, in terms of my publications, Dawn, I don't have a lot of them online. There's a couple of them online on the site called academia.edu, which a lot of people put their publications up on. I honestly don't put that many up because most of my publications, I actually signed a contract that says you can't post this publicly online to share it. Like I can send it to people individually, but I can't go and like post it on a website freely available because that potentially takes away from the publication. So I generally don't do that. I honor contracts that I sign. But if somebody wants anything in particular, I do list my publications, although to be honest, I haven't updated it in a while. But I do list everything. So if anybody wants anything, they can send me a private message. And I can always send a PDF or something, but I don't post them online if I have that restriction. So, so Brian's mentioning religious texts. Yeah, so it depends on what kind of religious texts. I'm not sure which kinds you mean, Brian. I mean, the offering formula is obviously kind of a religious text, so I would go with that, and related things like the appeal to the living. Carlos is asking, what's your favorite time period and or place? Don says, I think it's middle. That's true. Middle Kingdom is my specialty. So Middle Egyptian is the primary stage that I also use. I was trained also in Old Egyptian and Late Egyptian and a bit of Demotic, although I have to say that I didn't ever really use the Demotic after the class I took, so my Demotic is not really there anymore. But Middle Egyptian is the one I use the most, so that's the one most fresh for me. And that is the one that pretty much everybody learns first because it's the classic stage of the language. It's the one that they keep using over time throughout Egyptian history, even when it's not spoken anymore. So it was actually the vernacular spoken language, at least early on in what we'd call the Middle Kingdom. The language, spoken language, of course, changes much faster than the written language in a lot of ways. And over time, the language changes eventually into what we call Late Egyptian. Of course, there's no like really hard and fast line between these stages. Language just changes gradually over time. But they keep using this sort of standardized Middle Egyptian for religious texts, official like royal monuments, tombs, etc. And so Middle Egyptian in a lot of ways is very versatile like that. So yeah, and specifically in the Middle Kingdom, I guess I should mention my favorite stuff that I really deal with has to do with administration, families, like family influence and social groups, and things like that, and the interplay between, you know, the government, basically the administration, and different families who are involved in it, and like how much sway did different people have and stuff like that. That's some of the main focus. I also work on some much later stuff in the Third Intermediate period because we have a collection here locally that I've been researching. And if for any of you who signed up for RC for the RC lecture series, I'm giving the talk this coming Saturday, and I will be talking about that collection. So I won't be talking about the Middle Kingdom there. I will be talking about Third Intermediate period material, and actually a lot about how it got here in the first place, like what was going on with it in the 19th century and 20th century and so forth, and how I figured out some of the history of it. It's got a lot of kind of strange stories associated with it, so hoping it will be an entertaining talk for people. So he was asking me to make some more videos on architecture. Yeah, at some point I probably will. I have to say it's not on the short list right now, but imagine I will get to that. There's so many topics I can do. Focusing on language right now, but I'm sure that not too far in the future I will probably shift again to another theme for a little while. A link for the talks. I don't, because you have to be a member of RC, the American Research Center in Egypt, to be able to register. So they haven't posted the registration form publicly. It's sent to you if you're a member, but I do have somewhere here the list of speakers. If I can find it, I will take a quick look and see what I can find. So let's see, mine is this Saturday, and then the week after that, and the formatting is probably going to get totally messed up with this, but I will copy and paste what we've got. So that's May 30th. And I'm putting in the chat June 6th. And you guys are going to see this in the chat before you see me saying it, because there's always a delay. So you're probably like, what the heck is that? Oops, and I didn't get the title on that one. Let me copy the title on that one. Carlos is asking if the talks will be available later. No, they've not been recording them. Or if they are recording them, I think they're just for internal use, not for sharing later. So the last one I just posted, David Anderson, hasn't announced the title yet, so I don't have the title for that one. But let's see, and then who's after that? Then on the 20th is Leslie Ann Warden, who I haven't seen the official topic for yet, but she did mention at one point she was going to be, to me privately, that she was going to be talking about beer. So unless that's changed, I'm assuming that's about beer. And then on June 27th is Salima Ikram. Don't have a title for that one yet either. And I do believe they are planning some more lectures for further along in the year, because we're presumably probably still not going to be having chapter meetings in person for a while. But it probably not going to be like an every week thing like it is right now, but I think they will periodically do them later on. So I know a few of you actually joined RC so that you could see these, which would be great. It'll be cool to see. I know the way we're doing it, I won't, there isn't like a live chat like the way that this is, but there is a Q&A box and stuff, so you can always ask me questions there too if you want. Or if you don't get your question in at the time, you can ask me the next time I'm on YouTube live or something. So let's see, I just pasted a lot of stuff in here. Let me see if there's anything else here I missed. Vernon Tyler from Brazil, welcome. And P, got glad to hear you like the Nile video. That was actually one of my earlier ones, so probably not the most sophisticated, but it's used a lot actually, get a ton of views. Let's see. Somebody asking about how I feel about Coptic. I just have not studied it. I mean, I'm sure Coptic is wonderful. It's one of them. It's the main reason we were able to decipher hieroglyphs. It's just not something that we didn't study it in grad school in my program, and it's not been. There hasn't been, the time versus priority mix in my life has never been in the place to allow me to acquire yet another stage of Egyptian. So I haven't done that. Let's see. You're welcome, John. Glad you're enjoying it. All right. So with that, guys, I'm going to wrap it up for today. But I will be back again next week. Plan to be here same time, same day. And I will again announce it in my email and on social media. I announced it a little bit late on social media today because I was just, other things happening and so forth. But you'll get the YouTube alerts too if you're subscribed. And I hope to see some of you there in my talk on Saturday too. Thank you all for coming today. It was a great time. You had some wonderful questions, and hope this was helpful. I will see you again soon.